Alrighty then, in today's video I'm going to be kicking off my best reads of 2020 series, starting with the best fantasy books that I read in 2020. Since on this channel I also look at gothic horror and classics, I'll also be doing lists for these two genres, areas if you prefer as well. Also, in the midst of all this I'm going to have a little bonus video where I rank the Angela Carter books, as that's something that a couple of you mentioned you wanted to see in my Reader's Guide to Angela Carter video. But as I said, this week we're looking at the best fantasy and also sci-fi books that I read in 2020. Before we begin, I'd like to say a couple of things about the list. Firstly, this isn't a list of books that actually were published in 2020, rather it's a list of the books that I read in 2020. The second thing is there's no ranking here, these are just great books that I read, and therefore I just want to talk about them and recommend them to you guys. Okay, so with all of that blather out of the way, let's get into the list. So I thought I'd kick off the list with one of the weirdest books that I read this year, and that is Ice by Anna Kavan, published in 1967. Ice is a hallucinogenic sci-fi novel that tells the story of an unnamed male narrator who is travelling through the world pursuing this love interest who is also unnamed. This is all set in the context of a nuclear apocalypse which has turned the world into basically an ice planet, and as he's chasing his love interest, the ice is also chasing them. But for me, it wasn't the plot that put this book on the list, but rather it was the atmosphere and the strangeness of the story. Ice is a really weird novel that's hard to describe in detail, at least in terms of what goes on in the novel. Some characters seem to die at parts of the novel, but then return later on, so you're not sure if they actually did die. Also, characters seem to change appearances throughout the novel, and the chronology of the novel also doesn't seem to be linear at all. And the narrator himself is definitely right from the off someone who comes across as very unstable mentally, and as a reader you're often wondering whether this is actually happening at all, whether there actually is this ice apocalypse, or whether this is all just the ravings of a murderous loony. If you want to brighten up the end to what's been a pretty drab year with a dark apocalyptic book, then Ice is definitely a book to go for. It's got a very wintry, cold atmosphere, not just because of the setting, but also just the way that Kavan writes. She really does capture this feeling of just dread and coldness and darkness. Also, the book itself is very short, and it is the kind of book where when you finish it, you do want to reread it because you do want to kind of understand what went on in the story. So if you want a book that not only is a book that you can read once, but a book that you could read several times over just to try and understand it, this is definitely a book to pick. Before I move on, I'd also say if you are interested in reading this book, go and do a bit of research on Anna Kavan herself, because she was a very interesting lady with a very interesting life, and I also found for myself that knowing stuff about her life did kind of put this book into a little bit of context and made it all the more interesting to read. Next up on the list we have the final book in the Chronicles of Narnia series by C.S. Lewis, The Last Battle, published in 1956. So in the final book of the Narnia series, most of the children who have appeared in the previous books come back to Narnia for one final adventure, and we witness the end of Narnia itself. This is very much an end of days story, and of all the Narnia books, I think it is one of the most allegorical ones with respect to Christianity, and it's also much darker than the previous books were. Now, I actually put this on the list not because I think it's the best book in the Narnia series, or even a particularly, fantastic book, but because having reread the series this year, and when I was much younger I didn't like this book much at all, and would have probably said it was one of the weakest, having reread it this year, I actually found that it resonated with me in a way that I didn't expect, and therefore made it really interesting to read. I think when I was younger, I just didn't really like the darkness in this book. I thought that the ending and the fates of the characters was just a bit too much, and I also didn't really connect that much with the villains in this one, or the kind of general story just wasn't as captivating as some of the other Narnia books. And also, if I'd have reread this when I was a teenager, probably the Christian allegory stuff would have bugged me. But both of these two things really didn't bother me all that much this time. I was able to appreciate the allegory, especially because Lewis's writing style is really beautiful, especially in the passages that deal with the ending of Narnia. It reminded me a lot of The Magician's Nephew, where we see the creation of Narnia, and I had a similar thing with that book. I really enjoyed those scenes where we're witnessing the creation of the world. So on this reread, I did find that actually it did provide a satisfying conclusion to the series. Still, I'm not going to sit here and say it's one of the best books in the series, but what I will say is it's underrated, and if you haven't read the series since childhood or early adolescence, then I would definitely recommend going back and reading them and seeing if you have a similar experience to what I had with this book. For the next book on the list, I picked something a little bit more modern. We have the second book in the Gentleman Bastards series by Scott Lynch, Red Seas Under Red Skies, published in 2007. What I love most about the Gentleman Bastard series in general is that it has some of the grimdark elements that are quite popular in contemporary fantasy, but at the same time it has a lot of comedy and lightness to it, which kind of balances out some of the grimdark elements that are also present in the stories. And this to me makes for a much more realistic kind of fantasy than some of the grimdark stuff, which claims to be, you know, gritty and real, but actually is just a bit over the top, a bit nihilistic, and, you know, when it's badly done, it can even be a bit silly. What I like about Gentleman Bastards is that, yes, there is darkness and very harsh, grim realities in the world, but there's also a lot of fun to be had. There's also a lot of, you know, jokes and prankish games and, you know, happiness in general, which I really appreciate as a reader because I prefer worlds that have everything in them, whether that's, you know, gritty, dark elements and also the more light-hearted elements of life. Also, I just think that Locke Lamora is one of the best modern fantasy protagonists that I've come across, and his friendship with Jean Tannen, which is one of the kind of linchpins of the series, is also just a great friendship. And it's nice to have a series that's focusing very much, at least up until the point I'm reading now, which is the second book. Their friendship is still kind of the thing that keeps the series grounded, and it's the thing that you're following as a reader, which is great, because, you know, usually friendships are parts of novels, but oftentimes they get overlooked for things like romance. So I did read both of the first two books in the series this year, but the reason why I put the second book on the list is because I think it just edges out in terms of quality this time. I found the villains more interesting in this book and also the plot. I also thought that Lynch didn't shoot himself in the foot by killing off some of his better characters early on before they had a time to really develop. And even with the characters in this book that don't make it out of the novel alive, he was able to give enough character development to them before that point that they still felt like, you know, really strong, well-rounded characters, rather than maybe putting a bit less effort into them because you know they're going to die, so, you know, why bother? And lastly, I just enjoyed the setting more in this book as well, which is mainly a preference thing. I just thought that the pirate stuff was really fun and entertaining. If you haven't read the Gentleman Bastard series, I would definitely recommend beginning it, because both of the first two books, at least, I haven't read the third yet, but I will be, are pretty flawless. And I think in terms of modern fantasy, it's definitely shaping up to be one of my favourite series. Dialing it back now in time, we have Ursula Le Guin, and the first book in her Earthsea cycle, Wizard of Earthsea, published in 1968. So I read A Wizard of Earthsea for a book club, and because it was a classic fantasy book that I didn't know that much about, I was kind of expecting a Tolkien-esque kind of fantasy story, and that really wasn't what I got with this book, and that was great. Although Le Guin certainly does have some very intricate and complex world building, what is the draw of this story, and arguably the other books in the series, are the characters and the personal journeys they go on through the story. In fact, with this series, I would say that a lot of Ursula Le Guin's world building and magic system pretty much serve the personal character development that's going on, rather than being kind of, you know, almost gimmicky sometimes things that magic systems can be. What I liked was that the magic system and the character development, at least in this book, kind of fused together in a really beautiful and interesting way. Another thing that impressed me with this book is that, unlike a lot of fantasy, which, you know, can arguably be quite bloated at times when you've just got authors who love to go on and on about their worlds, Le Guin really doesn't do that. She incorporates enough world building and enough mythology to tell the story that she wants to tell, but she's not going to spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages doing that. She's going to focus on her story, and she's going to draw on the magical elements when they're relevant to that story, which I think is pretty fantastic. And that she can tell such a compelling story with all that world building mythology there in just, you know, 100 or so pages is really impressive. As fantasy classics go, I do certainly think that this is, you know, a bit overlooked in terms of things like Lord of the Rings, and I would definitely recommend, if like me, you haven't heard of this book before, you should definitely pick it up and you should definitely give it a read, because it's wonderful and also a really refreshing kind of fantasy, even by today's standards. Now, moving forward in time again, we have a book that is just a month older than me, and that is The Fires of Heaven by Robert Jordan, published in 1993. So this is the fifth book in the Wheel of Time series, and for many readers, it seems to be one of the high watermarks, if not the high watermark, of the series. Now, it does certainly have some major events in the series, which I'm not going to spoil, and it also marks a big shift in direction for the series as well. This really is the book where we begin to really start moving away from Rand-centric stories or stories centered around the Eamon's Field characters, and Jordan really starts expanding his world, focusing on the many, many side characters that we follow throughout the series. It's also the book where a lot of the adult characters who up until this point are, guiding our characters and shaping them. This is the book where they start to begin to take a real back seat, and it's the children, or, well, I guess they're adults, I think, by this point, who are now taking on positions of responsibility and starting to be more active in the story. So the reason I put this book on the list was for a similar reason that I put The Last Battle on this list. When I first read the series, I had a lot of expectations for this book because I really like to read people's rankings of things because I'm always interested to know what people's preferences are. And given how high this one was always ranked, I always kind of looked forward to reading it and had lots of high expectations. And when I read the book, I actually found it was okay, it was good, but it didn't seem to me to be as great as some of the books that I'd read already. I did find the story quite bloated, and I especially Nynaeve's character and Elaine, when they just spend all the time in the circus. When I first read the book, I just didn't really care about this and wanted to get on with what I saw as the main plot. But this time around, because I know the plot of the story, I was able to appreciate the character development in this book a lot more. In fact, I would say that the stuff with Nynaeve actually became something that I really enjoyed at this time around, which is a testament to how good this series is. The fact that it, even though it is such an undertaking of 14 books, you can reread it, and actually rereading it seems to be, so far for me anyway, better than the first time. Now, The Wheel of Time is a very intimidating series, as I said, because it's so long, but I would recommend reading it and giving it a go because it is definitely worth it. Okay, so I did say that I wasn't going to do any ranking on these lists, but I am going to make a special highlight to this final pick on the list because I think this might be possibly the best book that I read this year, or at least the book that I enjoyed the most. And by book, I actually mean books, because the last pick on my list are the first two books in the Gorman Guest trilogy by Mervyn Peake, Titus Groan and Gorman Guest, published in 1946 and 1950. So before I describe the book, the reason why I picked these two books and cheated a little bit was because I think that these first two books do actually tell a very self-contained story and have a very broad arc that just kind of fits perfectly together. Also, I just can't pick between them which one I liked more. I think I'd like them both for very different reasons. Maybe at the moment I like the second one more because it's more fresh in the memory, but I did enjoy both of them. And they go together, so I'm putting them both on this list. Gorman Guest tells the story of Titus Groan, who is the heir to the throne of Gorman Guest, which is a place that's completely isolated from the rest of the world, by mountains, by swamps, by forest, and in the centre of this place we have Gorman Guest Castle, which is embedded in the mountains and is this huge labyrinthine structure that some characters can actually just get lost in for decades because it's just so big and people don't know where they are. It's really creepy, really gothic, and just fantastic. Now, Gorman Guest Castle and the people of Gorman Guest are all bound and tied to these mindless traditions that have gone on for hundreds and possibly thousands of years. And it's got to the point where no one really knows why people follow these traditions anymore. They just do. And this has had a pretty corrosive effect on the minds of the people in the castle and the characters that we meet. In the first book, Titus Groan, we get to see how the effects of this kind of oppressive system of tradition has basically damaged psychologically all of the various members in the castle, whether that's the Lord and Countess, whether it's their daughter Fuchsia, or the servants, and also some of the villains. And then in the second book, Gorman Guest, we focus much more on Titus Groan himself. As he matures as a character, he goes through adolescence, and he begins to rebel against all of these traditions. Meanwhile, in both books, there's this villain called Steerpike, who is slowly looking to get power and move up through the castle, and does some pretty shady things along the way. These two books were just flawless, really, for me. Now, they are tough to read. Mervyn Peake does have a very heavy prose style that's reminiscent of things like Dickens, but he does have the wit and the humour to make it fun and keep it light, even if it can be hard to read. Also, every character in the book is a winner. There were no characters, even minor ones, that I felt were duds. They all have something unique about them. They're all interesting, and they're all insane, but, in a good way. Like with Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea cycle, this is a fantasy series that is about characters and their development, rather than focusing on world building and magic systems. In fact, Gorman Guest takes it even further than Le Guin does, because in Gorman Guest there is no magic system, at least not in the first two books. And the only reason I think it's called fantasy is because it just has the setting and atmosphere and kinds of characters that you might get in a fantasy book. And I think that's one of the reasons why I enjoy it so much, because it has elements of fantasy without doing any of the standard tropes. It has elements of gothic fiction without succumbing to, kind of similar tropes that we've seen time and time again. And it's just a great classic book that fits all the genres that I like really well and tells a very interesting and wonderful story. If I was to recommend one book or two books on this list that you should read, it would definitely be the first book of the Gorman Guest trilogy, if not the second one as well. If you enjoy character-focused fantasy books, if you enjoy fantasy with kind of gothic and dark elements to it, if you enjoy fantasy that doesn't focus too much on complex magic systems and world building, then you'll definitely enjoy Gorman Guest. Alright, that's it for this list. Do let me know what you think of the books on this list if you read them. Also, let me know what were some of the best fantasy books that you read this year. I'm already going to be working on a reading list for next year, so I'd love your recommendations because I will certainly be adding some of them to my list. Take care, and I'll see you all next time.